Okay, let's start on the first verse. Were you there when they crucified my Lord? Were you there when they crucified my Lord? Oh, sometimes it causes me to tremble, 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 tremble. Were you there when they crucified my Lord? Were you there when they nailed him to the tree? Were you there when they nailed him to the tree? Oh, sometimes it causes me to tremble, tremble, tremble. Were you there when they nailed him to the tree? Were you there when they laid him in the tomb? Were you there when they laid him in the tomb? Oh, sometimes it causes me to tremble, tremble, tremble. Were you there when they laid him in the tomb? Were you there when he rose up from the grave? Were you there when he rose up from the grave? Oh, sometimes it causes me to tremble, tremble, tremble. Were you there when he rose up from the grave?
Amen, Jimmy. You did good.
All of you done. I heard you.
All right. Appreciate you being here. We're going to start something new tonight. We're going to look at some of the parables of Jesus. We're not going to go through, one tonight and then one next week. We won't go through all of them, but I want to go through as many as we can. And then when we finish on the parables, then we'll start a survey of 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, and just kind of go over those, because those are something we preach on every now and then, but we don't really do study on, so we'll tackle those. So we're going to start in Luke chapter 10, but I want to give you a kind of a crash course in biblical hermeneutics, the way to interpret the Bible. I think the parables are we especially need to know this before we start tackling the parables, because they're different. It's a different way of teaching. It's a different way that Jesus spoke these things. The word parable is a Greek word, parabole. It's equivalent to the Hebrew word mashal. They're the same thing, one Greek word, one Hebrew word, and they mean to be similar or to be comparable. So a parable is something that's comparable to something else. So when Jesus spoke in parables, he is comparing them to something else. And I'm going to give you a matter of fact, I forgot this. Tracy, you mind going in my office and looking on my table right there? There's a stack of handouts in there. If you can get them, there's Scott can. There on my table in my office, there's a stack of handouts. You can bring them in here. Because I want us to go over that. Let me give you some definitions of parables, because you probably heard some of these. The parables obviously are the teaching method Jesus chose. And when Jesus chose the teaching method of a parable, it is for a specific reason. It is either going to tell us about his expectations for people, That's one of the reasons he told the parable. Or it's going to tell us about the kingdom of God and the kingdom of heaven. So when Jesus taught a parable, it was for one of those reasons. In other words, every parable that you look at, you can find something in that. And so he'll tell us that in a parable, this is what I expect of you. This is what I want you to know. Or he'll tell us the kingdom of heaven is like this. So a parable is almost like a simile or a metaphor. It ties it into something else. So what Jesus did was use very common things, very ordinary things that people already know, and then Jesus took it to compare something spiritual. And so that's really what a parable is. You may have heard the definition of a parable as an earthly story with a heavenly meaning. A lot of people use that definition for a parable. It's just an earthly story about a vineyard or about a man or about some animals or whatever, but it has a heavenly meaning to it, which is true. But I want to caution you real quick before we really get into this. There is and I want to briefly go over this. That over the course of human history, there's been a lot of different ways of interpreting the parables. It starts out that most people early on believed that each parable taught one lesson. But that's really not true. So when you look at these parables, there's sometimes multiple lessons involved in them. They're embedded in one another. They're very vivid imageries. They're very vivid stories. They really relate ordinary things, and that's really what they are. But he tells them in a really vivid, very vibrant way, and it leaves a lot to the listener. When Jesus is telling these parables, it relies a lot on your imagination. You have to imagine these things. You have to imagine what he's saying. You have to imagine the scene. Because he's going to tell you about a man giving coins to his servants and then going and burying them in the yard. So you have to have your imagination to see them going and doing that, because he's going to tell some things in that story that you really have to visualize. It's a little different than just a straight doctrinal statement. Where if we say, for God is love, or for God so loved the world, that's a pretty straightforward doctrinal statement. You not a whole lot of imagination there. But if I start telling you about a rich man dies and goes to hell, and a poor beggar goes to the bosom of Abraham, and then I start telling you a story about that, you got to imagine some things. So that's what the parables are all about. They are, and I think I've used this term for you before. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are what we call synoptic gospels. Synoptics a Latin word for just to see. In other words, they're basically saying the same thing. They're eyewitnesses. They're seeing the same thing. So anytime you ever hear somebody say synoptic gospels, they're talking about Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Those three are where the parables are at. John has no parables. So if you look at John's gospel, there's no parables in there. Because when Jesus taught in John, Jesus is teaching primarily about himself and about his unique relationship to the Father. So in John's gospel, John doesn't record anything where Jesus is teaching about the kingdom of heaven or really what's expected of you or any of that kind of stuff. He's talking about himself. Jesus is teaching about himself. So the parables are in those three. However, Mark is very light on parables. There's only a handful. And the reason being is Mark is what we call it's a fast-paced gospel. It's one action right after another. There's not a whole lot of narrative. It's just Mark tells a story. Matter of fact, Mark has been saying, most scholars believe that Mark is pretty much Peter's preaching notes. So Peter's preaching all these sermons, Mark taking notes of the sermon, and Mark writes a book about it. And so it's real. There's not a lot of commentary, not a lot of diatribes in it. It's just one action right after another. Matthew and Luke contain all the narratives. Matthew and Luke contain all the parables. So that's where the majority of them are. And Luke is really famous because in Luke's gospel, Luke concentrates all the parables really between chapters 9 and chapter 19. We call it the journey section of Jesus. So if you look at Luke, starting in chapter 9, going all the way to chapter 19, it is his journey to the cross. It's all the way to the cross. So it starts with the persecution of Jesus when they start amping up their rhetoric against him. And then Jesus starts telling parables. And then Luke records all those in that little section. So we're going to see a lot of those. Matter of fact, the first one we're going to see tonight is in that section. Now, interpreting parables is difficult. It's debated a lot. There's a lot of controversy about it. And we're going to go over that little sheet you have in a minute. But let me just break this down and show you how it's changed over the years. In the early church, and we're talking about the early church, the very first century, Augustine and some of those guys, when they interpreted parables, it was all allegory. In other words, it's a poem or a story or a picture that represents something else. And so it was all allegorizing for them. In other words, they didn't see any history in it. They didn't see any literary merit in it. It was all just kind of a made-up story. So that took place really about the first, I'd say, 1,400 years or so. Let me give you an example. In Matthew chapter 18, and you don't have to look here. I'll tell you, we're going to talk about this parable later on down the road. But in Matthew chapter 18, Jesus tells a parable about an unmerciful servant. Do you remember the parable where Jesus said this guy owed the king a lot of money, the king forgave him, and then the guy went out and had one of his buddies owed him $10, arrested him? Jesus told that parable. And one of the things we're going to talk about is when Jesus tells a parable, there's a reason he told a parable. And the reason he told the parable is Peter said, right before the parable, how many times should I forgive somebody? Should I forgive somebody 7 times or 70 times? And Jesus said 70 times 7. And so these early church people, like Augustine, for example, focused on those numbers. And they tried to allegorize those numbers. For example, when Jesus said 70 times 7, Augustine looked at it and said, you got 2 sevens, so 77. So he said, okay, there's 77 generations between Adam and Christ. 77 must be the secret number for the remission of sins. And so he said, so when I interpret that parable, 70 times 7 to me means just keep forgiving. But for Augustine and those people, they said, well, that represents every sin that's ever committed in humanity. He had a definite idea about it. That's what I mean by allegorizing. Later on, they took it towards the 1500s or so, and they started using historical. What was the historical basis for it? What's the actuality of all this? Now we get to the modern times, and in the modern times, there's a lot of, and I'm telling you all this for a reason, because as we go through these parables, we're going to use some of this to figure out what these parables actually mean. In modern times, there's all kind of, most scholars have moved away from allegorizing, and they look at it as a historical thing. And they have 3 different types of ways to look at it. They have form criticism, which means they look at the history of the content. They have structural criticism, which means they look at specific genres. They have redaction criticism, which is a liberal way to do it, which they're trying to go back and change everything to make it fit their idea. And so there's a lot of different ways to interpret it. Now, I gave you a handout with some principles. As we go through these parables, I want us to look at these principles and see if we can figure out what the parable's actually saying. So look at the A right there, initial impressions. And this is just my hands on you to read these, because I want you to go back and read them after we talk about them, and then I want you to read the ones that we don't talk about. But you always read it out loud just like a story. Just read a parable like a story. And because it's important to hear it, all right? So read the thing. And then compare it. Compare the wording in different Bible translations. If you have a computer, you can do it with a computer. Letter C there. Look for clues associated with it. Luke chapter 18, verse 9, there's a narrative hint in it that's very telling for us, and we'll talk about that when we get to it. Luke chapter 12, verse 22 and following, Jesus tells a parable. What's important is the teaching after the parable. It's not necessarily the parable, it's teaching after. In Luke chapter 12, he tells a parable. You've heard this parable before. He says a rich man had a lot of stuff. And he said, I got all this stuff. And I need tear down my barn and build more barns and bigger barns because I got all this stuff. And so he tells this parable, and you think, okay, it's about greed and all this, which it is. But what he says next is more important than the actual parable. After the parable, Jesus said, for us, don't take thought about tomorrow, what you'll eat or what you'll drink. God will take care of you. So he tells this parable, but then he teaches afterwards why the parable is important. That God will take care of you. That you don't have to build all these barns and accumulate all these treasures, that God will take care of you. So it's the teaching afterward that really helps. In Luke chapter 12, verse 13 through 21, which is the same as we're going to look at in Luke chapter 10, what triggered it? Why did Jesus tell it in the first place? All right, so I'm going to show you that in chapter 10. Then the characters. Always look at the main characters. What's their point of view, what they're doing, how they're interacting with each other. Then you look at the structure. How they interact with each other, how the characters are interacting with each other, what they're doing, like the one guy that goes to the king, gets forgiveness, then he goes out and interacts with another fella and throws him in jail. How are they interacting with each other? Then in letter F there, words and expressions. There's going to be some things that are unclear. You have to figure it out. Use dictionaries, concordances, that kind of thing. Then G is the context. Figure out how the parable fits into the bigger narrative. How does it fit into everything else Jesus is talking about? Rich man and Lazarus, Luke chapter 16 is a good example because it's demonstrating Luke's concern of stewardship in the context of Jesus' journey to the cross. Because Jesus is being a good steward of what God's asked him to do. Because Jesus is going to the cross and he knows he's going to the cross. And so Jesus tells a parable, and that parable that he tells about a rich man and Lazarus is in the context of Jesus going to the cross for us. So look for that. H is the synoptic comparison. Look at the difference between Matthew and Luke primarily. I is the background, which as a historian, that's what I like. I like the cultural, the geographical, the historical background of what was going on when this was said. J is the Old Testament passages. Anytime you want to read, especially a parable, anything in the New Testament, especially a parable, look at the Old Testament. How it relates. And then you can look at the commentaries. Well, I would suggest you to get one. L, summarize the meaning. Every time you read a parable, especially, ask yourself, what I learned from this. How did this speak to me? Because it's going to speak to all of us different. And so you say, what does this speak to me about? M is more for pastors, really. But you can't answer that one. How is it relevant for our church? N is the communication barriers. Like, for example, the parable of the laborers in the vineyard. These guys get hired at 8 o'clock in the morning, they work all day. The guys get hired at 6 o'clock, they work for an hour, they get the same pay. That offends our economic justice. In our 21st century thinking, we think that's unfair. You can't work 12 hours and then somebody that works 1 hour gets the same pay. But Jesus told the story for a specific reason. But for us, it's weird. Now, and the preaching teaching outline, unless you're preaching teaching, you already need that one. But you have to look at the parables on a case-by-case basis. Now, that brings us to the actual parable. And we're not going to do this every Wednesday night. From now on, we'll jump right into the parable, all right? But bring these sheets with you and we'll look through them. But in Luke chapter 10, starting in verse 25, there is a parable here. I'm going to read it for you, and then we're going to talk about it in detail and look at some of those little hints I gave you on that page and see what we can figure out, because I want all of us to really learn how to read these things and interpret them for ourselves and figure it out on our own. So look at verse 25. Here's the parable. And a lawyer stood up and put him to the test, saying, Teacher, what shall I do to inherit eternal life? And he said to him, What's written in the law? How does it read to you? And he answered, You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. And he said to him, You have answered correctly. Do this and you will live. But wishing to justify himself, he said to Jesus, And who is my neighbor? Then, verse 30, Jesus replied and said, A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell among the robbers, and they stripped him and beat him and went away, leaving him half dead. And by chance, a priest was going down on that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. Likewise, the Levite also, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, who was on a journey, came upon him. When he saw him, he felt compassion. He came to him and bandaged up his wounds, pouring oil and wine on them, and he put him on his own beast and brought him to an inn and took care of him. On the next day, he took out 2 denarii and gave to the innkeeper and said, "Take care of him, and whatever more you spend, when I return, I will repay you." Which of these 3 do you think proved to be a neighbor to the man who fell into the robber's hands? And he said, "The one who showed mercy toward him." Then Jesus said to him, "Go and do the same." All right, everyone knows that parable. We read that thing 100 times in churches. But I want us to kind of parse it out and look at it kind of in regards to those little sheet I gave you. Look at that story, because I didn't start it. The parable actually starts in verse 30, but I started reading to you in verse 25. Anybody got a clue why we start reading in verse 25? Because we ask ourselves, what triggered the parable? Why did Jesus tell the story? Why do you have to tell it in the first place? Well, look at verse 25. A lawyer stood up and put him to the test. So there's a dispute between Jesus and a lawyer. It's not a legal lawyer. It's not a guy that has a briefcase, goes into court. This is a nomikos. It's a religious lawyer. It's a Pharisee. And this Pharisee is wanting to argue with Jesus. He's an expert in the Jewish law. And so, remember, this is that journey section of Jesus. So everything between Luke chapter 9 and Luke chapter 19 is the Pharisees trying to trap Jesus. It starts in chapter 9, and it intensifies as it gets further on down the road. Matter of fact, John's stories, his signs, his miracles, correspond to this section, to this journey section, and it culminates in John chapter 11. They're out to get Jesus, they're out to get him, he's doing all these things. Finally, he raises Lazarus from the dead, and they all get together and say, "He's dead, he's got to die. He's got to go." Luke drags it out a little bit more, and he tells us more stories, more things that happen on that journey to the cross. And so on this journey to the cross, all these people are trying to get Jesus. And here's an example of this nomikos, this lawyer that comes up to Jesus, and he asks him a question. And the question starts in verse 25. "Teacher, what shall I do to inherit eternal life?" Sounds like a pretty straightforward question. What do I do to be saved? Actually, that's what he's asking. That's not what he means. He's wanting Jesus to say something contrary to the law. He's wanting Jesus to offend the Pharisees. He don't want to know how to inherit eternal life. He thinks he already knows that. He's a Pharisee. That ought to be good enough. He's wanting to treat Jesus. So this is what I always tell you. It's okay to ask God a question. But be careful, because God sometimes don't just respond. Sometimes he asks a question in return. So look what Jesus says in verse 26. So Jesus responded to the question and said, "Well, what's written in the law? What does it mean to you? How does it read to you?" So Jesus responds to the question with a question. So just by those 2 verses, what you see is Jesus and the lawyer in this dialogue dispute. They're in this theological argument where the lawyer's trying to one-up Jesus. He's trying to be better. And so the lawyer, again, and when I say lawyer, maybe I should say this Pharisee, this religious Pharisee, thinks he's got it nailed. He thinks he's got it right. Because he quoted the Shema, or part of it anyway, from Deuteronomy. Look at verse 27. He said, because Jesus said, "What's written in the law?" He said, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself." That's part of the Shema teaching. So he says to Jesus, "What do I do to inherit eternal life?" Let me see if I can trick you in it. Jesus said, "What does the law say?" Well, what do you read in the law? God said, "Well, it's easy. Let me quote the Shema." He's very proud of that. Matter of fact, he probably had on a phylactery, which is a little box with the Shema written in little letters, taped to his forehead, with a leather band going around it, going all the way down his arm. So when Jesus asked him, "Man, this guy probably said, I've been trained for this my whole life. Ever since I was in Hebrew school, as a little kid, and my bar mitzvah, I had to pass all this, so I know this." And so he told Jesus, he said, "This is This is how you do it. So verse 28, Jesus said, "You're right." That's right. That's exactly what it says. And if you do this, you'll live. But then the lawyer tried to get cute. Then he tried to push it in verse 29. But wishing to justify himself to Jesus, and it doesn't really mean justify, it means, we could actually translate verse 29, but wishing to win the argument, he said to Jesus, "And just who is my neighbor?" Because Jesus, he said, yeah, you love the Lord your God with all your mind, heart, soul, strength, and your neighbor is yourself. So the guy's like, well, who's my neighbor? You know, who exactly is my neighbor? Again, verse 29, you can't really read a whole lot into that except for he's trying to win this contest. He's trying to win. So now, and what you don't know is he asks a very dangerous question. Because they're not by themselves in a room, they're surrounded by people. There's other Pharisees around, there's other people around that are non-Pharisees. There's a crowd of people. Everywhere Jesus went from at this point, everywhere he went, there's a crowd around him somewhere. And so what he asks is going to be very dangerous because it's about to blow back on him. See, he doesn't know what he's asking. So now the parable is in verse 30. This is the parable itself. Verse 30, Jesus replied and said, a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho. I told you this other night, if you were here. Anytime, and this is just, it's just kind of a side note to all this. Anytime Jerusalem is referred to in the Bible, or even now if you go to Israel, it's always referred to, you always go up to Jerusalem. Jerusalem's on a hill. And so you always go up to Jerusalem. It's figuratively, because Jerusalem's the place of worship, it's high, it's lifted up. And it's also physically, it's lifted up. So when he says he's going down, that's physical. He's going down about 2,500 feet. Jerusalem's about 2,500 feet above sea level. Jericho is about 770 feet below sea level. So it's a difference of about 3,300 feet that he's going down this mountain. It's a winding, dangerous road. I think I've told you all this. I wish I would have brought a picture that I could pass around. But it is and again, you go in my office, right above my table in my office, there's two big framed pictures of Israel pictures. I think the one on the left-hand picture, far left, I believe, you'll see it just like a desert. That's where he's talking about. It's a road that goes from Jerusalem down to Jericho. There's nothing there. There's a big ravine, like a mini Grand Canyon that cuts through it. And so matter of fact, we was up there taking pictures, and some little kid ran up selling us bracelets and all kind of stuff. You want to buy this? And you could look down into this ravine, and there's a really cool, and it's the picture in my office, there's a really cool monastery that's built into the side of that mountain. So you can look down in this ravine, there's a monastery just built right inside the cliff. I have no idea how they get down there into that thing, because there's no road to go down there, but it is. But as you're going down this road, there's caves, there's no trees, it's not a forest or anything, but there's a lot of caves, there's a lot of big rocks that people can hide behind, and it's notorious for bandits. Crooks hide in those caves, they hide behind those rocks. They call it the Valley of the Shadow of Death. That's what that's called. David probably wrote Psalm 23 standing there. He's probably standing there looking off into this place and thinking, even though I walk through this place, the most dangerous place imaginable, you're still with me. You're my shepherd who's guiding me along this path. So Jesus says, let me tell you this story. You want to know who your neighbor is? Let me tell you this story. He says there's this guy that was going up from Jerusalem. He's going down into Jericho, and some things are going to happen to him. It's a dangerous road. For me and you, it don't mean anything. Even today, it don't even mean anything because it's tourists and buses going down through there. But to the people that heard this, they would have immediately had a vision in mind. Like if I say to you, if I say to you right now, there's a man that's unarmed walking through the south side of Chicago, with lots of money on him, you immediately think, well, that guy's in lots of danger. You know, that's not a very safe place for this guy to be. Well, when Jesus told this, that's exactly what they thought. There's this guy's, I mean, he's in a bad spot. So Jesus then says some things happened to him. Look at verse 30. He fell among the robbers, which is pretty common, and then they do three things to him. They do three things which leaves him a particular way. They strip him, they beat him, and they leave him half dead. Right? Think about those three things. They strip him, they beat him, and they leave him half dead. Who else that reminds you of? Jesus. That's what's happening to him. He is on his way to the cross. I mean, not this day, but he's on that journey. It's already started for him. So he tells the story. He said, this is what happened to this guy. And so they strip him, they beat him. He's half dead. I don't know if he's in a coma or what. But look at what they left him without. Clothing and speech. He has no clothes, and he has no speech. He's half dead. What are the two ways that we evaluate people now? Clothing and speech. What they wear and how they talk. That's like it or not, that's the way we judge people. That's the way we evaluate people. If somebody brand new came into this church, whether you want to admit it or not, first thing you're going to do is look at them and gauge their appearance. And you're going to look and just see. I mean, I'm not saying that you're necessarily going to say, oh, this is a bad person because of the way he's dressed, but you're going to notice how they're dressed. It's just the way we're processed, the way we do it. So Jesus said this guy gets attacked by these robbers and they leave him without the two primary ways that people identify each other. He has no clothing and he has no speech. Now, this man represents anybody in need. Jesus is not telling a story to represent one particular guy. He's representing all humanity who is in need, which is all of us. You know, we're all in need. And so he's going to tell this story, and remember, it's in response to this lawyer trying to one-up Jesus, and he says, well, you tell me who my neighbor is. And Jesus said, well, I'll tell you the story. So this guy's going down from Jerusalem, Jericho. He gets among the robbers. They beat him, they strip him, they leave him half dead. And this man can't communicate. He has no identification on him. I mean, nobody knows who he is. And he is in desperate need. He's just laying there on the side of the road. And he needs somebody to help him. Verse 31. Imagine to say, this is what I'm telling you, your imagination has to come into play here. Because the Pharisee is asking Jesus this question. They're in a little verbal dispute here. And there's a lot of people standing around listening. And so Jesus is telling this story, and they're all ears. They're all, okay, this sounds like a pretty good story. Then verse 31, Jesus said, and by chance, a priest was going down that road. All the Jew ears perked up. Because the priest is going to be the hero. Because I'm telling you, there's only one reason for common folks to go to Jerusalem, and that's to go to the temple. Or in our vernacular, to go to church. And so the priest is the guy that's administering the sacrifices in the church. He's the guy that's in charge of the temple. And so Jesus is telling the story where these folks are being led to believe that this guy has just left a church service where the pastor of the church was at, and now this guy's been beaten, he's left half down the side of the road, and lucky for him, the pastor walks by. The priest comes along. The guy that he needs comes by. And so all the Jewish people are listening. They got to be like, okay, Jesus is one of us after all, because the priest is going to be a hero. But then verse 31, Jesus said when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. So I'm telling you, they were offended because their priest was not the hero. Their priest is the guy that didn't help the guy in need. He saw him there, he's half dead, he's laying on the road and he leaves. So they don't, I'm telling you, they're not going to like that. Then verse 32, he says, a Levite comes down. The Levite is the guy that's in charge of the temple furnishings. He's the guy that's washing the altars, and he's got this cleaning out the water basins and all that. In other words, the priest and the Levite are the temple personnel, the religious folks. And so if the priest is not going to be a hero, the Levite's got to be the hero. One of them's got to be the hero. So verse 32, he says, when he came by, he saw him, and he passed by on the other side too. So they got to be a little bit offended here, because here's their two main religious guys that probably just served their tour of duty up in the temple. They come down the road after leaving the temple, and this fellow human being is in need. He's been beaten and left half dead by robbers, and they ignore him. The religious people are ignoring him. And so he says, and by the way, the lawyer who asked this question would have been very supportive of those two guys. They would have been his people. But then look at verse 33. But a Samaritan. So now Jesus introduces somebody else who is the most unlikely person to be the hero. At this point, when Jesus said the word Samaritan, it became very uncomfortable for the religious folks, especially the Pharisee asked him the question. The Samaritans, and you probably know, they represent a rival group to the Jewish establishment. Jews and Samaritans didn't get along, and it went back generations. They thought the Samaritans were just half-breeds and mixed people that had no purity in their ethnicity and didn't matter. They were not valuable folks. And so when Jesus, matter of fact, the Samaritans had their own version of the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Old Testament. The Samaritans wrote their own version of it. They didn't use the Jewish version of it. And so it didn't sit well with Jewish people. So Jesus said, but a Samaritan who was on a journey came upon him, and when he saw him, he felt compassion. So the most unlikely person was the most compassionate. The one guy in the story that the Pharisee hated is the guy that Jesus picked to be the hero. It was totally opposite of what was expected. It wasn't what they thought. Now, here's the problem, and here's what I say, there's multiple layers of stories in this, multiple principles for us. Here's one of the stories for us. You ready for this? The priest and the Levite, all their religion was lived out in the temple. They didn't live their religious life outside the temple. A lot of Christians do that. You know that, right? There's a lot of Christians that just live their Christian life in the church. And while they're in the church, they're the greatest Christians ever. But you go out and find somebody in need, and they're going to pass by on the other side. I got to help them. They're just going to act like they don't see them. You're going to ignore them. And so when Jesus tells this story, it's not just for the first century Jewish people. There's lessons in here for us. But he says this Samaritan come along, and this Samaritan did the thing and had compassion. In verse 34, he came to him, he bandaged up his wounds, he poured oil and wine on them, put on his own beast, brought him to an inn, took care of him. Next day, he said, I'll give you 2 denarii. 2 denarii equals 2 days' wage for a common laborer. So he gave the innkeeper the equivalent of 2 whole days' pay of his own. So Jesus is not only telling the story to make the Samaritan a hero, but he's making him a really good hero. He's giving up 2 whole days of pay. And he said, take care of him, and whatever more you spend, I'll get back to you when I get here. So you just, in other words, run a tab. So now what makes this story relevant? What makes this story tick? There's a contrast in here. Jesus paints a very distinct contrast. There's a priest and a Levite on one hand who are the outspoken religious folks. And then there's a Samaritan who is the outcast on the other side. And Jesus puts them in direct contrast with each other. He says what the Christian people should have been doing, the lost person did. It's actually reversed. And so the priest and the Levite respond with inactivity. They don't do it. They don't help. And the Samaritan responded the way they should have. He goes to this guy. I mean, he takes care of him, he gives him all this stuff, and says, I'll come back. Now, look at, because Jesus is not finished yet. I'm telling you, when you ask Jesus questions, sometimes he hits you back with something that's difficult for you to answer. So watch what Jesus says now in verse 36. Which of these three do you think to prove to be a neighbor? That is a tough question for this Pharisee. It's tough. Because Jesus said, there's a man in need, there's two religious folks, and there's an outcast, a man you hate and despise. But which one of them was actually the neighbor? And I can imagine if Jesus wanted to, he could have popped off and said, are you open your big mouth about who's the neighbor? Now you tell me, who's the neighbor here? Who really acted neighborly? Watch this. I'm going to show you how this guy still don't get it. Watch this. Verse 37. And he said, the lawyer said, the one who showed mercy. Can't even say Samaritan. He can't even say the Samaritan. He said the one who showed mercy. He can't. He still don't get it. It can't come to say this Samaritan guy was the compassionate one. The neighbor was the Samaritan. He can't say it. And so he had to answer him because all these people standing around. He said, I want to show mercy. I don't want to give this guy props. I can't say his name. Now watch this, because this is the part that stings in verse 37. Jesus said, you go and do the same. That's the part that hurt. Because scribes, teachers, would have students sitting at their feet listening. Basically, in Jesus' day, most time each town, Bethany, Capernaum, whatever, they all had their own rabbis. Each rabbi, students would come up to rabbis and say, okay, I like the way you're teaching. And the student would say, I want to learn from you, and I want to come and sit at your feet, and I want to travel around with you, and I want to sit and talk to you, and I want to learn from you, especially what we call an apprentice. And so the students would seek out these rabbis, and the rabbi would teach them, and then the rabbi would say, okay, now you go do what I just taught you to do. Jesus flipped that around. First of all, Jesus went and got his own students, which was totally not what they did in the day. Students sought out the teacher. Jesus sought out his students. But look what he says here. He says, okay, the Samaritan is the guy. Now you go do the same. In other words, Jesus is saying to him, which is a tough thing. Jesus is saying that you are to now be the scribe to this guy. You are now to sit at his feet. In other words, this guy that you hate, and you're a religious expert, you're a lawyer of the law, I mean, you know everything about the law, but this guy that you hate has now become your teacher. So I want you to go sit at his feet, and I want you to learn from him. That's tough. That's a tough thing for that guy to hear. Because this guy wants the Pharisee to be, the Pharisees, the religious people, they're supposed to be the good guys. They're supposed to be the heroes. But they totally abandoned this person in need. So, you understand what I'm telling you about parables? There's a lot of different levels to it, and we always have to ask ourselves, why is Jesus telling it in the first place? And what's his point in it? And those are his. They're trying to defeat Jesus with these arguments. So this guy tried to start this argument that he wasn't going to win. He just kept on, digging himself in more of a hole, till when finally Jesus said, okay, let me tell you a story, put this out there. And then Jesus told this story that totally upended everything this guy believed in. Everything he put all his work in, his life in, his study in, everything, Jesus tossed it all out the window. And he said, that is not the way we operate. That is not what being a neighbor is. And so you're not take those same lessons. We take those same lessons about what Jesus is telling us, and we say that, first of all, Jesus is on his way to the cross to take care of us just like this guy did for the guy that fell in need. We're hopeless and helpless. I mean, Jesus is going to take care of us. He's on his way to do that. Now that he has, and we know him, you and I are supposed to read this and ask ourselves, are we really being neighborly? Are we living our life inside the church? Is this all the religion we ever get? Or are we actually going out there and helping other people? Are we taking it outside the church walls? And just, man, we'll take an opportunity, we're going to have to do that. But we can't just be Christians here. You don't flip it on and off like a switch. You're a Christian wherever you go. You represent Jesus wherever you go. And if somebody's in need, we got to help them. Any questions about that parable? And I hope these will be beneficial to you. Next week we'll look at the parable of the rich fool in Luke chapter 12. So if you want to read ahead and look at that one. But anybody got any questions? All right. Well, I'm gonna sign off with our online folks. Thank you guys for being.